Miss Morstan entered the room with a firm step and an outward composure. She was a small, dainty blonde young lady, well gloved and dressed with perfect taste. However, there was a plainness and simplicity to her costume that suggested limited means. Her dress was a somber grayish beige, untrimmed and unbraided, and she wore a small turban of the same dull hue, accented only by a hint of white feather on the side. Her face lacked regularity of feature and beauty of complexion, but her expression was sweet and amiable, with large blue eyes that were remarkably spiritual and sympathetic. Throughout my experiences with women across many nations and 3 separate continents, I had never seen a face that promised such a refined and sensitive nature. I couldn't help but notice that as she took the seat Sherlock Holmes offered her, her lip trembled, her hand quivered, and she displayed clear signs of intense inward agitation. She expressed her reason for coming to Mr. Holmes, mentioning that he had once helped her employer, Mrs. Cecil Forrester, with a domestic issue that had deeply impressed Mrs. Forrester with his kindness and skill. Holmes thoughtfully repeated the name of Mrs. Cecil Forrester, recalling that he had been of some slight service to her in a very simple case. Miss Morstan asserted that Mrs. Forrester did not share that view, but insisted that her own situation was far stranger and utterly inexplicable. Holmes rubbed his hands together, his eyes shining with interest as he leaned forward in his chair, his features displaying extraordinary concentration. He urged her to state her case in brisk, business-like tones. Feeling somewhat out of place, I rose from my chair, but was surprised when Miss Morstan raised her gloved hand to stop me. She suggested that if I stayed, I might be of inestimable service to her. I settled back into my chair. She briefly outlined her circumstances. Her father had been an officer in an Indian regiment who sent her home when she was just a child, leaving her mother deceased and with no relatives in England. She had been placed in a comfortable boarding school in Edinburgh until she turned 17. In 1878, her father, then a senior captain, obtained a year's leave and came home. He had telegraphed her from London, sharing that he had arrived safely, and instructed her to visit him at the Langham Hotel, his message filled with kindness and love. Upon arriving in London, she learned that Captain Morstan had gone out the night before and had not returned. She waited all day for news, and that night, following the hotel manager's advice, she contacted the police. The next morning, they placed advertisements in all the newspapers, but their inquiries led to nothing. Since that day, no word had ever been heard from her father, who had returned home filled with hope, seeking peace and comfort, only to vanish. She choked on her words, putting a hand to her throat as her voice faltered. Holmes inquired about the date of her father's disappearance, and she informed him it was the 3rd of December, 1878, nearly 10 years prior. He asked about her father's luggage, to which she explained it remained at the hotel, containing no clues, just some clothes, books, and various curiosities from the Andaman Islands, as he had been one of the officers in charge of the convict guard there. Holmes then asked if her father had any friends in town, and she mentioned only Major Sholto from his regiment, who had retired and lived at Upper Norwood. They had reached out to him, but he was unaware that his brother officer was in England. Holmes remarked on the singularity of the case. Miss Morstan continued, stating that the most peculiar part had yet to be revealed. About 6 years ago, specifically on the 4th of May, 1882, an advertisement had appeared in the Times seeking the address of Miss Mary Morstan, and suggesting it would be to her advantage to come forward. There had been no name or address listed. At that time, she had just begun working for Mrs. Cecil Forrester as a governess. Following Mrs. Forrester's advice, she published her address in the advertisement column. That same day, she received a small cardboard box in the mail containing a large, lustrous pearl with no accompanying message. Since then, every year on the same date, she had received a similar box with another pearl, each time without any clue as to the sender. An expert had appraised the pearls, declaring them rare and of considerable value. As she spoke, she opened a flat box and revealed 6 of the finest pearls I had ever seen. Holmes found her account most interesting and inquired if anything else had occurred to her. She revealed that just that morning she had received a letter which she offered for him to read. Holmes accepted the letter and requested the envelope as well, noting the postmark from London, S.W., dated July 7. He observed that there was a thumb mark from a man on the corner, likely from the postman. The envelope was made of good quality paper, which he noted was sold at 6 pence a packet, indicating a particular man in his stationery. The letter contained no address and read, "Be at the 3rd pillar from the left outside the Lyceum Theatre tonight at 7 o'clock. If you are distrustful, bring 2 friends. You are a wronged woman, and shall have justice. Do not bring police. If you do, all will be in vain. Your unknown friend." Holmes commented on the intriguing nature of the mystery and asked what she intended to do. Miss Morstan expressed that this was exactly what she wanted to ask him. Holmes assured her that they would certainly go, suggesting that Dr. Watson would be the ideal companion, as her correspondent indicated she needed 2 friends, and he and Holmes had worked together before. She questioned whether Dr. Watson would agree to come, her voice and expression filled with an appealing uncertainty. I fervently assured her that I would be proud and happy to be of any service. She expressed her gratitude, explaining that she led a secluded life and had no friends to turn to. She asked if arriving at 6 would be acceptable. Holmes insisted she must not be late, but then inquired if the handwriting on the letter matched that of the addresses on the pearl boxes. Producing several pieces of paper, Miss Morstan confirmed she had them on hand. Holmes praised her for being a model client and displayed keen intuition as he examined the papers, giving quick, darting glances from one to the other. He noted that while the hands were disguised, there was no doubt about the authorship. He pointed out distinctive features in the handwriting, noting the irrepressible Greek E and the twirl of the final S, concluding they were undoubtedly from the same person. He then asked if there was any resemblance between this handwriting and that of her father. She replied that the two were nothing alike. Holmes had expected her answer and confirmed they would look for her at 6. He requested to keep the papers, indicating he might investigate further before their meeting, as it was only 3:30. He bid her au revoir. With a bright, kindly glance at both of us, Miss Morstan replied au revoir, replaced her pearl box in her bosom, and hurried away. I watched her walk briskly down the street from the window until the gray turban and white feather became a mere speck in the somber crowd. Turning to Holmes, I remarked on what a very attractive woman she was. He had relit his pipe and leaned back with drooping eyelids, responding languidly that he had not noticed. I exclaimed in disbelief, calling him an automaton, a calculating machine, and remarked that at times he seemed positively inhuman. With a gentle smile, he explained that it was crucial not to let personal qualities bias his judgment. To him, a client was merely a unit, a factor in a problem, and emotional qualities could obstruct clear reasoning. He recounted that the most charming woman he ever knew had been hanged for poisoning 3 children for their insurance money, while the most unattractive man he knew was a philanthropist who had spent nearly $250,000 on the poor of London. I attempted to argue that in this case it was different. Holmes maintained that he never made exceptions, because an exception disproves the rule. He then asked if I had ever studied character through handwriting, and what I made of the letter's script. I described it as legible and regular, indicating a man of business habits and some force of character. Holmes shook his head, pointing out that the long letters didn't rise above the common level. He noted that certain letters could be mistaken for others, suggesting a lack of character in their differentiation. He saw vacillation in the man's K's and self-esteem in his capitals. He declared that he was going out to make a few references and recommended a remarkable book, Winwood Reade's Martyrdom of Man, before stating he would return in an hour. I sat by the window with the book in hand, but my thoughts strayed far from the bold speculations of the author. Instead, my mind lingered on our recent visitor, her smiles, the deep richness of her voice, and the strange mystery surrounding her life. Realizing that if she was 17 at the time of her father's disappearance, she must now be 27, a sweet age, where youth loses its self-consciousness and gains a touch of sobriety from experience. I continued to muse until such dangerously distracting thoughts filled my mind that I hurried to my desk and immersed myself furiously in the latest treatise on pathology. I questioned what right I had, as an army surgeon with a weak leg and a weaker banking account, to entertain such thoughts. She was merely a unit, a factor, nothing more. If my future appeared bleak, it was surely better to confront it like a man, rather than to try to lighten it with mere illusions.